All right, everyone, welcome. Opening session. I'm Steve Nafziger from Williams College, and we're delighted to have this session on early modern institutions. So our first presenter is Mattia Bertazzini from Oxford, and he's going to be presenting the economic origins of government. He's right there. The slides are there. For those in the room here, just to let you know, Mattia, we got, roughly speaking, 20 people in the room. And then we'll have discussion from Noel. So Mattia has 15 minutes, Noel has up to 10, and then we'll open up to our short Q&A at the end before going on to the next paper. So with that, take it away, Mattia.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here today. I hope you can see me and hear me well. It's a pleasure to present this paper, which is joint work with Bob Allen and Leander Heldring, where we study the economic origins of government going very, very far back in history. Now, before I give you a bit more detail about what we do in the paper, if I can switch slides, there we go. Let me give you a bit of motivation about why we think this is a very important topic to research, even though a lot has been written on it. So first off, when we look at the literature on early state formation, we find a lot of good papers looking at what we call the supply side theory of state formation. That is to say, an explanation of early state formation linked to incentives for coercion and taxation. The story being, whenever there is an economic surplus to extract, extractive elites form, create states to extract this surplus. Now, even though this theory is fascinating in itself, this is a bit at odds with the way we tend to think about states and governments in economics, whereby states and government intervention is typically needed to solve a market failure. And on this second strand of reasoning, which we call the demand-side theory of state formation, there's very little empirical research done, especially on the origins of state. So what we do in this paper is precisely to test this hypothesis, whereby we hypothesize that maybe the first states in history have formed to address a market failure. And when we think about the market failure in this paper, we think about a market failure linked to environmental change that may have led to a collective action problem. Okay, and we hypothesize in this setting that if this environmental change could be offset, if the negative consequences of this environmental change could be offset by public good provision, then there would be demand for state, and people may be willing to enter a social contract whereby they would give up some resources in the form of taxes in exchange for public goods. Now, obviously, testing this hypothesis empirically is complicated for a variety of reasons. First of all, there's a data constraint. States collect data on states, so it's very difficult to trace the development of state because of that. And second, we would have an identification problem. That is to say, we would need local variation, both cross-sectional and temporal, that induces a local market failure of the type we're interested in. So what we do in the paper is we look at southern Iraq, which used to be called Mesopotamia by the ancient Greeks. That literally means the land between the rivers. And the reason for that is that today, the stretch of land, the southern Mesopotamian plain, is literally in between two big rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. Now, that was not always the case. Now, it was the case when the Greeks wrote about it, when Herodotus wrote about it, but in reality, these rivers have not always been in the position where they're now. In fact, these rivers have shifted a lot over time, and I will give you a bit more detail about that in a second. And these river shifts, we claim, are an excellent exogenous shock to collective action that we can study. Now, the reason for that is that southern Iraq is a very dry place. The climate is quite dry. And for farming, you need to irrigate. Now, typically water for irrigation would come from the rivers, but when a river shifts, and this I will show has happened quite a few times over history, the local population would face a trade-off. Now, one possibility would be to simply migrate to where the river has shifted or to a different portion of the river. Another option would be to stay, organize artificial irrigation by building canals. Now, if the second option is the one that people choose, then a collective action problem arises that may lead to a demand for states. And the reason for that is that building and maintaining canals is something that can be tricky because of free riding and overuse of public resources. So to address both these problems, people would need somebody to supervise this process. And thus, we claim in this context, they may be willing to exchange taxes for public goods, that is canals and canal supervision, and thus enter a social contract. So this is the very big picture of what we do. Now, in terms of these river shifts, as I've said, there were many over time, but just to give you a sense of the magnitude of these, this is really relevant. In red, you see the location of the Tigris and Euphrates around 5000 BCE, and in blue, you see the location of rivers today. So these shifts were large and clearly could have a massive impact on these agricultural communities. Now, in terms of the collective action problem, I can't go too much into the detail here due to time constraints, but we do find a lot of nice qualitative evidence showing that this was indeed a big problem throughout Mesopotamian history. Now, I'm not going to read the quotes here, but for instance, from well-known legal codes, for instance, Hammurabi's code from around 1800 BCE, we see that there was great attention to canal maintenance, and the king went to a great length in order to make sure that his subjects would behave well when it came to canal maintenance and overuse. We also have evidence of actual social contracts of the type we have in mind related to irrigation. This is an example from what is called the Neo-Babylonian period, around about 600 BC, where we see an actual contract between the state governor and a farmer, where the actual amount of taxes the farmer had to pay to the state in exchange for canal maintenance is set out in detail. Okay. Now, data, of course, is very important for what we want to do, and an ideal data set we may want to use to test these hypotheses of state formation stemming from demand for states to solve collective action pressure would need to be made of microdata, should be in panel format, and should allow us to trace the process of state formation over the long run, because we may think that institution building might happen over long periods of time. So our solution to these challenges is basically to use archaeological data, which is very nice in this setting because it's been extensively researched by incredible archaeologists. And mostly we focus on two sources. Firstly, some sweep surveys that basically were made with the intention of collecting the universe of settlement throughout history and canals. These are very nice because, of course, they were made to give us the universe of these. So there's no selection into sample here, at least in an obvious way. And the second innovation of the paper is to use number and size of administrative buildings to proxy for the location of states and their capacity. The idea being that the location of administrative buildings allows us to understand where administrative capacity was located and therefore where states formed throughout history and built state capacity by looking at the size of these buildings. Now, when we put all this together, we get 31 cross-sections for the 31 archaeological periods of our surveys, that each cross-section includes a reconstruction of the riverine network, location of settlements, locations of cities. For each city, information on public buildings. These are temples, ziggurats, and palaces. And later in history, when there is a large canal network, we also know about the location and length of canals. Now, our working definition of states is basically those cities that have at least one administrative building. And for those periods for which there are territorial states and there are documented historical boundaries, we also know the exact reach of the states, such as in this example from 2900 BC. Now, river shifts were plausibly exogenous. They were linked to exceptional level of rainfall in northern Turkey and Syria. They were very difficult to predict. They were impossible to prevent. We can show these shifts are not correlated with previous economic activity and human activity. Therefore, we can use them as plausible exogenous variation. Now, this is a very interesting picture for us. It shows two things. First of all, if we look at the temporal dimension of our data, that is rainfall, the black line, and our proxy for state capacity, our administrative buildings. This is number of administrative buildings. The blue line, we can see this interesting negative correlation between water availability from rainfall and state formation, which in itself speaks against this idea of states forming to extract surplus when more surplus is available. Okay, and then the other important feature of this graph is that it shows the river shifts we have in our study period. There's 6 of them. We do not show results, average treatment effects for these 6 shifts altogether. We present them separately, starting from what we call the city-states experiment, which is the first bar, around 2100 BC. This is an experiment when we go from a situation of independent cities to territorial city-states. We then show results from what we call a centralization experiment, where we move from territorial states to one centralized empire. And finally, we'll show results from a placebo experiment when there's a decentralized government in territorial states. There is a river shift, there would be incentives for state formation, but simultaneously to the river shift, a foreign invasion happens. That is an Assyrian invasion, which prevents local organization and state formation. Okay, so we're going to show these 3, the rationale being they are the first of their type. There's other 3 similar to them, which we report in the result appendix. Empirically, what we do is we split the study area into 5 times 5 kilometers grid cells. We define a grid cell as treated if in t-1 it was located within 5 kilometers of a river, and in time t is not located next to the river anymore. The control group is therefore made of all those cells that were either on the river and are still on the river in T0, or were more than 5 kilometers away and they're still more than 5 kilometers away. We do different specifications, it all checks out. Now, the estimating equation is the following, and what we do here is we build artificial panels, each made of 3 subperiods around each river shift. And what we do then is we estimate each individual river shift separately. Okay, so what you see here is on the left-hand side one of our measure of either state presence or public good provision or economic activity, that is settlement. Then we've got grid level fixed effects, period relative to treatment fixed effects, period relative to treatment interacted with our definition of treatment, some area-specific time trends, and clustered error at the grid cell level. Okay. Now, because of the nature of the specification, we express both the coefficient for T0, so the treatment effect, and the pre-trend lag 2 relative to lag 1. Okay, so you should think about the coefficients we estimate relative to t-1, basically. This is the sample area, which we take from the archaeological surveys I mentioned before, split in 5 times 5 kilometer grid cells, and this is in graphics what we do. So these are cells that will be treated once the rivers shift. These are the same cells after the river shift. And then what we do is we look at, and these are grid cells with settlement in t-1. What we do is we look at where new states, based on the definition I've given before, form after this river shift. And we find that they tend to concentrate precisely where the rivers have shifted away. We find that canals are provided where the river was in order to compensate for this loss of water for irrigation. And we see then when these canals are built, settlement in T0 stays constant. So this is basically the story in a few maps. Now I'm going to show you the same in tables very quickly. Panel 1 here basically shows you that there's a differential increase in the probability of being under a state if you're treated. This is column 1 for the city-states experiment, the one going from independent cities to territorial city-states. We see for the centralization experiment that the capital city moves closer on average to those places that are treated. And we see that this movement of the capital city does not take place in the placebo experiment. We can repeat the exercise for alternative outcomes, for instance, size of public buildings in the capital city, and we see that this differential increase for treated places is there also for this measure, not there for the placebo experiment. Do states do what we expect them to do in this context? Do they provide the public goods we think they should provide? They do. In fact, for both the city-state experiment and the centralized state experiment, we see there is a differential increase in the likelihood of being located within 5 kilometers of a canal after the rivers have shifted away. And again, we see no effect in the placebo experiment. Lastly, to close the argument, what happens to economic activity once states form and public goods are provided? Settlement stays constant when this happens. It even increases a little bit, perhaps, while it collapses completely when the placebo experiment happens and states do not form because of this foreign invasion that I've mentioned before. Now, just very briefly in the last couple of minutes, another interesting finding of the paper that we obtained by looking at heterogeneous effects is that, of course, even though collective action pressure is everywhere, states are scarce. So we don't see states popping up every time there is a collective action pressure. So we ask why that is the case. And in order to answer this question, we split our sample area at the mean of different measures of economic incentives. These are preconditions for state formation. We think about these proxies for economic incentives as preconditions for state formation. And what we do here is basically showing that states, this effect of river shifting on higher likelihood of states forming, is concentrated in places that had higher suitability for irrigated agriculture, enjoyed lower irrigation costs due to them being located close to a main branch of the river, had higher population density in T-1, and were aligned naturally with more settlements in T-1, which made the marginal cost of building a canal lower, basically. And this tells us that states do form in response to a collective action pressure, only provided the certain preconditions apply and certain economic incentives are in place. So just one last slide to conclude. The main contribution of the paper is really that even though existing studies emphasize the extractive origins of the state, we think the other part of the story is also very central and needs to be taken into account when we think about early state formation. That is, we have shown that in our setting, states form to counteract environmental change that leads to a market failure and a collective action problem. Secondly, in the debate between institutions and geography, we show that state formation is a tool through which people adapt to environmental change in a successful manner. And finally, to the literature on environmental change and human adaptation to it, we provide evidence that political organization can be a successful long-term strategy for people to adapt to environmental change. So this is a positive message going forward. Thank you all. I think I'm over time 1 minute, but could be worse.
Mattia, I think you have to stop sharing for me to share my screen.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see here.
All right. And now you have 10 minutes.
Okay. Is that up for everybody? Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to comment on this paper. I'll say, first of all, this paper is very good, right? And I think it's on a very interesting topic as well. A huge amount of data and the analysis is well done. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this summary, right? Because the presentation was quite good. But 3 of the big things I took from it that I'll return to, there's a claim in the paper that market failure drives the origin of large-scale government. So the word origins in there, right? As opposed to, building more state capacity on existing governments. So I'll return to that in a second. Second, this is a demand-side explanation for the origins of government. So I'll have a little bit to say about that. And like I said, massive data collection, very clever empirical strategy, and to be honest, a lot of moving parts to keep track of as well. So first thing about the data, these guys, they actually cite Ross 2017, and it looked interesting, so I read it, about talking about some of the archaeological work that went into collecting the data, which is significant. And Ross mentions that a lot of the reconstruction of where these rivers go when they shift is based on how settlement patterns have also shifted, right? So that's not the more recent constructions rely less on those settlement shifts, and more on topology and things like that, like that are in the geography. But nonetheless, to the extent that an outcome variable that they're also looking at are settlements, right, and density, then the fact that that could be correlated with where the rivers have been historically identified could be problematic. Second thing, you use in the paper 5 by 5 kilometer grid cells. You might have a robustness section like that uses a bunch of different kinds, but I didn't see anything saying like whether you know what the resolution is in the maps, for the historical reconstructions. Like, how good are they, right? And I mean, is there some way they could be cross-validated with something that you would know? And so if they're not like accurate to 5 by 5 kilometers, for example, then perhaps it would be more appropriate to use a larger grid cell. That's something simple to do in robustness. So in the estimation framework, something that I was wondering about was, is there a population gradient or a trade potential gradient running north to south in the sample area? So by construction, more towns that are located downriver than upriver are going to lose the river, right? So if there's also then something correlated with north-south in these data, then that's potentially problematic. I know you investigate pre-trends, right? But nonetheless, I thought that would be interesting to know, because I suspect that there's going to be more activity in the south than the north, but I'm no expert at all, in this part of the world. So as I mentioned, another point for the estimation framework, this is a very complicated paper, lots of moving parts, and I got confused sometimes, but that's only natural for me. So one thing that you made very clear in your presentation, right, but I didn't quite get, I had to go back and look a lot in the paper, was what was in sample, like, when the regressions were being run, because sometimes it felt like you were only looking at cells that begin on rivers, and then the treated cells were those that began on river and then lost the status, and then comparing those two groups, right? But as you made clear in your presentation, you're also including all the other grid cells that are far away from the rivers. So that's actually what you're doing. But then my question is, like, one of the major things you look at are investments in irrigation technology. But how is it possible for the rivers? So the cells that are on the river before the shift and also after the shift, why would they get any irrigation investment, right? Like, I mean, that's just not going to happen, right? I know you have other measures like the buildings and so forth, but I would also imagine that those buildings would have to be established in order to manage the irrigation investment that's being made, right? So that could just, you could clarify for me how that's handled by your strategy, or, if there's time. Another thing that struck me with this paper, I found there to be similarities between Blakely and Lynn's study of fall line cities in the United States. I won't go into what that paper does. Most people probably already know. But what I was thinking is that something that could be going on in the history here is that you have agglomeration, of people at the locations initially on the rivers. The rivers shift. Those agglomerations are not going to go away immediately because they're increasing returns, and that's where all the people are. Nonetheless, the government will find it worthwhile to invest in those areas because of the the increasing returns, all the people that are there. And a lot of the measures that you pull out for state capacity are biased towards finding investments made by hydraulic empires, right? They're going to be related, to the irrigation in the first place. And so my question, to put it kind of simply here, is how would I see in your data an increase in state capacity that's not necessarily about irrigation? Like the towns that are on a river and stay on a river, they could be taxed at a higher rate, but they just won't have administrative buildings being built. It's easy to get there, right? They're on a river, like in these sorts of things. So I was just a little questioning about that. Okay, interpretation. I'm not keeping track of time very well, so just stop me if I need to. So you say on page 3 of the paper I received that the effects you are looking at are basically suggesting that the people could be even better off where they lost the river. But these are despotic empires, right? And I didn't see in the data where exactly I should be finding that they're better off, right? And so that, and then whether this is a supply or demand phenomena. I mean, do we know, did people ask for government to come and tax them in exchange for public goods? Or did they accede, right, to pressure from the government, which would seem to be more of a supply side phenomena? And then finally, the origination of government claim. From reading that Ross paper again and just kind of poking around the internet, which I know is not very scientific, it seems that a lot of the debate around, say, the Witt-Vogel thesis is that he was right, that the irrigation that was being developed in places like Mesopotamia contributed to the development of state capacity, but it wasn't responsible for the origination of states. Like the timing, according to the archaeology I looked at, seemed to suggest that was off. Okay, and then finally, a last message to my friends in the audience who are wondering how I possibly could have done this whole discussant job on a paper that's about the Middle East with a scarce resource and environmental degradation in a time when this movie has just come out that everybody's talking about. And to you, I have to say, very good. Jokes fall flat on Zoom, but I had to try, everybody. Okay, that's it. I'm done.
Thank
All right,
you,
thanks,
Noel.
Noel. Okay, good. We have time for a few questions from either those who are online or those in the crowd. I will repeat the question for those who are in the crowd for everyone to hear, if there are questions. Watching multiple things at once. Somebody had a question. Oh, I don't know. Can anyone hear Deirdre online? No, they cannot. So you tell me and I'll tell them. She likes it. You can come up here if you want. You want to come? One second.
The joy of a
Although
hybrid
it's
form. Hi.
amazing and great project. You have qualitative results in your regressions, which I understand is standard in economics. And you may know that I and lots of other people have some problems with tests of statistical significance, but that's not the point here. The point here is it seems to me that you'd be able to get quantitative results in the sense of how big this effect is. And then you could test, as it were, in an engineering simulation way, whether the effect was of a plausible magnitude. And after all, that's what we want in science. We want oomph. We want things that matter and can be shown to matter. So I would hope that you would move to a further step in your argument, and how to express it. Winkle out, as it were, the magnitude of the effect, not just as a regression result, but in its implication for how much was being spent on these irrigation facilities and how much that mattered to the formation of states.
So Mattia, would you like to take 1 minute to either respond to Deirdre's remarks or to anything that Noel said before we wrap?
Oh, it looks like there's another question from Alan Dye, by the way.
Oh, Alan, sorry, I missed you there. We'll take one more question from Alan.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted to know if you have an idea who did the labor building the canals and how the state was able to obtain control of it.
Now you can wrap.
Thank you. Well, I really don't have, so first of all, thanks so much. These are all amazing comments that we will discuss with Leander and Bob, of course. So I'll start from the last one, which is more of a context-specific question. Some of these taxes were paid in kind in terms of part of the harvest. Some of these taxes were paid as corvée labor. Okay, so this is often how the government, whether that is a king or like local government, would find the labor necessary to build and then maintain these canals. For maintenance, they would also rely on the good behavior of the individual farmers that were along each canal. But that's more or less how I understand this works. The point on saying more about the magnitude of this, it's of course very good. We need to think about that. I don't have a good answer for that right now. We do know these effects are very large relative to the mean. So we do see consistently magnitudes that are about 1/3 of the mean, whether that is the average likelihood of finding a state or being under a state in a certain period or not. But I don't think in the paper we specifically discuss how much we can. So that there's no R-squared discussion in the paper at the moment. That is something we can think about more. And to Noel's many good points, I will just take a couple that I think were particularly interesting. And then Stephen, you tell me when I need to shut up.
Well, yeah, we do need to move on to the next paper. So why don't you, Noel, talk offline? Thank you.
Fantastic. And please do send me the slide, Noel. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, next we have Pier. Yeah, okay. Presenting, and I don't have the title in front of me, but you can tell them what you're presenting. So 15 minutes. You can find it. Yeah, it's on the desktop. Okay, I'm not going to share. Yeah. So no, they on the Zoom. I'm going to share the. Okay, PowerPoint. Perfect. Great. And I hope that you can hear me over Zoom too. You can. I'm sorry. Okay, this shouldn't take this long. Okay, finally, sorry. Yeah, I hope you can hear me over Zoom as well. So the paper that I'm going to discuss today tackled some rather classical questions of how institutions can foster trade and ultimately growth, and does so in a context that is ancient Greece. So it's about like a couple of millennia ago. And this is also going to imply that the kind of data and evidence that I'm able to show are somewhat limited, but hopefully insightful. And the way that I came to this topic is because of the somewhat recent but increasingly confident contention that ancient Mediterranean economies were able to grow intensively over the first millennium BCE. Of course, we're not talking of anything comparable to post-industrial revolution growth rates, but the phenomenon appears conspicuous enough that you might want to try and study it. And in particular, if you buy what this literature is suggesting, ancient growth was mostly Smithian in nature, meaning something happened that impacted market integration that allowed for a greater room of economic specialization from which some productivity gains could be reaped. And the next question would be what allowed for such market integration. And what my paper does in a somewhat specific or narrow way contribute a partial answer and study one peculiar institution, Greek Proxenia, and show how it could reduce transaction cost
and expand the frontier of profitable trades. So what is Proxenia? I hope I can show you. Yes. So Proxenia was an ancient Greek institution that entailed a very asymmetric relationship in between a city-state or a polis and an individual. The Greek called this individual a proxenos. You can roughly translate it in English as a public friend. And thus the city would declare that this individual who was not a citizen, who was always a foreigner, someone expected to live in another city, to be their public friend. And this was not an arbitrary decision, it was not random, but this individual was usually earned this recognition because of some past actions, some services he had performed in the past that had benefited the city somehow. And we have like different evidence of what these kind of services are, but they are not particularly conclusive. So let me just skip ahead. The important point is that he has done something of service to the city, and this has earned him some gratitude from them. And this was sort of a big deal for an ancient city-state in the sense that these grant of Proxenia were subject to considerable scrutiny. They were voted upon by the Popular Assembly. They were sanctioned by important magistrates and public officials. And these decrees were also often inscribed. So they would be reproduced in stone in public spaces. And when you read these decrees, you realize that you not only became a public friend, but you also received some meaningful economic and honorific benefits. So for instance, you could receive a tax exemption. You could receive a license to freely enter and exit a port of this city, and some, more fun things, possibly like a first row seat at the theater. And all of this was was actively meant to incentivize the proxenos to comply with an expectation. The expectation that it would operate, they would keep benefiting the city, and in particular, it would do so by operating as an inter-community facilitator of all sorts of interactions. So maybe an example, it's going to help. So if the city of Athens named a public friend in Corinth, this would mean that anytime Athenians were visiting Corinth for whatever reason, they might get help from the local public friend. So for instance, if you were a public official, maybe you received hospitality. They could attest your identity if they knew you personally or if they recognized the token. But for the private citizen, they could do things as important as sharing information on local market conditions or political conditions or the weather, and also have them access and influence local legal and political bodies. This is particularly important because a lot of legal protections only apply to citizens of the city, and thus you might need a local citizen to maybe speak to a magistrate and obtain justice for whatever happened there. And I think it's pretty clear to you, and as it was to me, that this institution has a clear potential of reducing transaction costs and economic transaction costs in particular, because those poised to benefit the most from this consul-like figure in another city were those systematically interacting with it because of trade or, more broadly defined inter-community in economic transactions. And thus, it should come to a surprise to you, as it came to me, that ancient economic history doesn't talk of Proxenia. So it's not appreciated in this light yet. There is a literature on this institution, but not really related to economic performance at the time. So in the paper, I go to, in some extent, trying to explain how, more in detail how this works, but you can boil down my interpretation of Proxenia in three hypotheses. The first one is that ceteris paribus, controlling for all other reasons, all other kind of interactions that you might want to ease with another city, that cities would appoint more public friends in important trade centers in order to reap the benefits of this reduced economic transaction cost. Secondly, if it's plausible that the beneficiary of Proxenia, the public friend, is himself involved in trade, is himself a businessman of some sort, then you would guess that economic motivations are particularly important in motivating this grant, because you can expect that someone who's themselves involved in this kind of interactions is better placed to ease them, to reduce transaction costs, to point out who are like a trustworthy business partner and the likes. And thirdly, if Proxenia worked as I contend, then you would also intuitively expect that trade activity increases following Proxenia grants. So I briefly mentioned data. How can we study this institution? Well, we are lucky enough that several of the many Proxenia decrees have been excavated by archaeologists, studied, digitized, and then you can search these texts to code information. And there are also other sources, but I mainly use this one to complement pre-existing data sets and basically end up with two main sources. One covers more than 4,000 individual proxenoi. I start from this data set and then integrate a bunch of information, disaggregate individuals, and use this wealth of data to reconstruct the network of Proxenia relations, compute some network statistics, but importantly, observe the structure of these Proxenia relations. And then we're going to relate the structure to city characteristics. And then I use the data from the inventory of archaic classical polis and already been coded to observe city characteristics. Importantly, I am really interested in trade, and I couldn't find some data set that covered it already. And so I propose a number of local time-varying trade proxies. And these are the number of Phoenicians, because Phoenician people, because they were famously protagonists of a trade diaspora, and because they specialized on this trade. When they could not find a colony, they would very often form a merchant enclave. The number of trade-related vocabulary that you can find in a city's epigraphic corpus, the number of shipwrecks that are known to have shipped from, to, or containing goods originating from a city, and then some sort of index that summarizes all this information and makes the most of it. What you can do with this is then, for instance, this is just just to realize that there is at least a co-occurrence of these Proxenia grants in between 500 and 0 BCE, and this general rise in shipwrecks, for instance, one proxy. But and then the second thing you can do is plot the network, and the point I want to bring home is that even though this is a Greek institution, it covers the whole Greek world, and it also intersects the Phoenicians in the East, Rome in Italy. So it is truly like a Mediterranean-wide institution. And you can use this network to, for instance, compute eigenvector centrality, and thus describe how attractive is a city in this network, both in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality of the Proxenia links that it's able to attract. So you can do one simple thing we can do is like cross-sectional regression, where we try to see whether the structure of the Proxenia network is indeed sensitive to trade intensity at the local level. And importantly, when you do such an exercise, you want to control for non-economic reasons, other types of prominence. And here I can control for this by a number of ways. Some direct ways are the number of colonies you had, how early you minted silver coins, whether it was Paleolithic sanctuary, how urbanized, how Greek, some linguistic and geographic controls, and also very interestingly an index of fame. So how much do we know about a city? Because this is this genetic fame is likely correlated with it, where you can think of genetic prominence. So an important military power, diplomatic power, economic tool, cultural seat. These all would result in greater fame for this city. And once you do this, you find that indeed there is, like trade seems to explain a large fraction of a city's attractiveness in this network. These are like beta coefficients, so the standard deviation increase in the outcome of aggregate centrality after one standard deviation increase in the regress. Of course, non-economic reasons are also important as captured by Fame, but economic reasons are, it seems, critical. And this is robust, depending on what kind of controls you include, what proxy you use, the periods, whether Athens is included or not, weights, and so on and so forth. For the second hypothesis, you see that to the left, I'm conditioning on whether I think that a proxenus is involved in trade based on the kind of economic incentives that he received to be motivated for this position. And when he is likely involved in trade, it is trade intensity at a local level that explains his appointment, whereas non-economic reasons appear less important. If you do the opposite and you condition on him not being possibly involved in trade, non-economic motivations are important, but trade is still there and keeps out about half of its magnitude. And you could see this as an indication that even though you did not appoint a merchant, you still had some regard for easing economic transaction cost at the local level. And this is also robust in a number of ways. Something we can move a bit further and consider a dyadic regression, meaning we consider all possible ordered pairs of target and source cities. And this allows you to control not only for the target characteristics, but also for the sources characteristics and for the characteristics of this particular pair, how close were those two cities. And I'm not going to show you results for the sake of or conciseness sake, but what I find is that sources characteristics don't really explain why a proxeny link exists. So it means that big and small centers were more or less as likely to make use of this institution. What is driving it is the target's characteristics, and in particular, trade intensity at the local level. And here also control for these pair characteristics that are, for instance, whether they fought in the same war, whether one is a colony of the other, they speak this language, are in the same region, and so forth. And then the third thing to speak about the third hypothesis is a panel regression. So the amount of variation that I have is not a lot. So for instance, I have to bean observations in 50-year beans, but we can at least try and study this by controlling for city fixed effects, period fixed effects, and thus sort of like cleaning the estimates from the general increasing trend in the outcome of trade, and some other controls. And what you find, so the interpretation here is the differential growth in trade that accrues from having received more proximity links. And what you find basically is that the variable that predicts trade at time t is the number of proximity links received at t minus 1. So at least in this differential trade growth, what seems to matter is the lag of proximity links, which makes sense to the extent that the t plus 1 value is sort of a placebo test, and these 50-year beans don't really allow us to perfectly observe contemporaneous reactions of trade to proximity. I think I'll stop here. I hope I'm not over time, and thank you.
So our discussant is Sheilagh Ogilvie. Sheilagh, can you say something?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, and your screen is slowly being shared.
Is it? Can you see?
One sec. We can't see it here.
I'll stop the share and try again.
Yeah, 1 second. Okay.
Shall I share again?
Yeah, try again. Yep, here it's coming. It's coming.
Okay. Can you see it?
Weirdly, we can only see half of it. The right. Now the whole there. There it is.
Okay, we're cooking.
Fantastic.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to comment on this paper. I am a big fan of peculiar old trading institutions, so this was a treat for me. There's a lot of great things about this paper. This paper analyzes a market supporting institution 2,500 years ago. And as we all know, markets don't work by themselves. They need institutional support. So it's nice to know some options on what might have supported them. It's about Proxenia, this public friendship status between a city and a foreign citizen. And on the basis of both a network analysis and a regression analysis, the paper concludes first that the Proxenia institution did reduce transaction costs, or had the great potential, showed the behavior you would expect if it were reducing transaction costs in intercity trade. And secondly, that it could provide more support for the idea that economic growth was actually possible in the ancient world. There are lots of things I liked about this paper. The nature of discussant comments is that one tends to focus on those things in the paper on which one would like to hear more, or that one's slightly worried about in some ways. And I'm going to do that. But before I start, I'd like to emphasize that this really is a super interesting paper as it stands. So my first concern is whether the associations which are shown in the network and the regression analysis are causal. The network and regression analysis show an association between Proxenia and intercity trade. But that does, as always, raise the problem of endogeneity. And although the paper does control for other characteristics, i.e. it controls for the problem of limited variables, I remained a little bit concerned about reverse causation. Proxenia might facilitate trade, but trade might make Proxenia grants more valuable. Now, we just heard that the panel data model suggested that Proxenia rises first, followed by trade. But, you know, we're historians. We know that post hoc does not always imply propter hoc. So I didn't feel totally happy about that line of reasoning. And I'm wondering if, I mean, of course, all of the evidence that Pierre deployed is indirect. It comes out of the network and regression analysis. Is it possible to deploy some direct evidence, possibly some qualitative evidence, that people were actually using Proxenia for trade intermediation? And I think in the paper, Pierre talks about the fact that Proxenia was also used for other purposes. And I think that was a really strong component of the paper. And it's particularly important because, like Noel, I went off and poked around on the internet and read stuff about Proxenia, having read Pierre's paper. And I thought, you know, there's this completely different view, which classicists and ancient historians have, which is that Proxenia is about political signaling and diplomatic signaling. A city will want to demonstrate that it's important and it's got lots of important supporters by issuing lots of Proxenia. So that would be a different view of Proxenia. And I thought that Pierre's paper was good in the sense that it acknowledged that sort of thing was also going on. But I think maybe some possible direct evidence that people were using Proxenia for trade intermediation would strengthen this worry that one has about whether the association that one sees is actually a causal one. I had a little bit of a niggle about the idea of involvement of the proxenos, the recipient of the declaration of Proxenia, the involvement in trade, because Pierre buttressed his idea of this causal link between the two, between Proxenia and trade, by his finding that association between the strength of the Proxenia network and his indicators of his proxies for trade, that link was stronger when the proxenos, the man or occasionally woman concerned, was involved in trade. This is measured by 7 economic benefits, which cities granted to the proxenas. And I was poking around in the appendices, and table A2 in the appendix paper actually lists these 7 benefits. And I felt as if I was only totally convinced that one of them was clearly trade related, the port license. 4 of them were very, very familiar to me from medieval trading institutions, about which I'll talk in a second. And they're useful for all alien visitors to a city. So immunity from seizure of assets, the preferential legal access, tax exemption, tax equivalency. They're typically granted to diplomats or indeed to any visitors, any important visitors, certainly ones who pay for them. So 4 are useful for everyone, and I wouldn't exactly call them trade related. And 2 of them seem more agricultural in the sense that one of them is the right to own land and real estate. Now you could say real estate, well, maybe that would be a trading house, but land? And the other is the right to pasture herds of animals, which I somehow feel is very agricultural. So I felt that it would have been nice to know a little bit more about the frequency with which each of these 7 measures of economic benefits occurred, maybe test out their effect separately, look at the effect of the clearly trade-related one, and then the one that could be trade-related but could just be useful for any foreign visitor, and kind of hive off those 2 agricultural ones, just, to test for robustness on this trade-related thing, because it was so important to the argument that this was a causal relationship that I thought strengthening that argument somehow would be more satisfactory. And is there the possibility, I wondered, of exploring other characteristics of individual proxenoi, whether Proxenia were inherited in families, whether you see continuity of names, surnames or prenames in the recipients of Proxenia of a particular city, honorifics, offices held, any further descriptors. So I just felt maybe knowing a bit more, if one could, about these proxenoi would again maybe strengthen that claim of a causal link. And finally, I would really be, or semi-finally, I would be very interested in knowing more about the wider institutional framework. We know that institutions function as components of wider institutional systems, and we especially know that pre-modern trade was governed by a multiplicity of institutions. So citizenship, not everyone who lived in a place had citizenship. Citizenship was a privilege. How did the privilege of citizenship work in particular cities? Because one knows it varied across European cities and city-states in the medieval and early modern period. And one suspects that citizenship in a city-state or a polity or an empire also varied spatially in the ancient world. Brokers and hostelers and brokers' guilds were important in intermediation in medieval and early modern trade. You've got local and alien merchant guilds and associations. You've got the legal system, which was not non-existent even in antiquity. You've got governmental institutions I've mentioned already, diplomatic ones, and you have the potential for forms of enterprise like family businesses and partnerships and so on. These other institutions could offer substitutes for or complements to proxenia, and they're much more enduring everyday institutions rather than being one-off ones. So they might be less well documented than proxenia are. And so I think asking the question, do variations across time and space in the prevalence or observations of these other institutions help explain variations in our observations of proxenia? And finally, and this really is finally, for every institution, you kind of want to know, why did it rise and decline? Before proxenia arose, which was around 500 BC, we think, was there no intercity trade? Why do you see this amazing peak exactly in the Hellenistic period between 323 and 166 BCE? Why did it ultimately decline rather precipitately after 0 BCE? Was it affected by exogenous changes in the political framework, the rise of Rome, for instance, the importance of Roman citizenship as perhaps as a substitute for Proxenia? I think discussing those questions about the rise and decline would help us to understand Proxenia better. But I'd like to emphasize this paper really makes us want to understand Proxenia better. So I really liked it. It's a great paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheilagh. Paolo, do you want to really quick respond up here? And then we probably should move on to the last paper.
I'm really grateful for the comments that Sheilagh made. I think are all absolutely on point, and I'll ask you to send me over your slides. Just two things for a matter of time. On the causality point, I entirely buy it, and my honest interpretation of the data would be that there is absolutely bidirectional causality. So it is true that places that have more trade intensity attract more proxenigrants, and then these incentivize even more trade to accrue later. And so maybe I've not phrased it well enough, but I take this paper as just documenting some facts and giving an interpretation of these facts, but I wouldn't, there is no IV, there is no diff and diff, so it's not a causal paper, and maybe I can make that more explicit. On the second thing, on the involvement of Proxenia in trade, I'll give you my reasoning for doing this. The immunity from seizure of assets, for instance, it's important because it's more of a trade-related sort of benefit, because it is also one of the most common ones, because those are the people who are more likely to suffer from this risk. So a diplomat that goes there like once every other war, it's different from someone who has to interact very often there. And the way in which this worked, the risk worked, is that if two cities were at odds with each other, then it would seize the assets of any citizens of the other city that they could basically get their hands on. The others, I don't think I have time, but even the tax exemption thing, again, so someone who interacts non-systematically is not really going to benefit from tax exemption, and it's more like a merchant and businessman would do. And so my reasoning is these are very costly to give out, and a police would want to give them to those who would benefit the most from them, so as to incentivize them sort of in an efficient way. And that's why I would see them as more trade-related than not. But I can do both the table with the frequencies and try and drop some for robustness. Thank you so much again for your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pier Paolo and Sheilagh. Next, we're moving on to Antonio Iodice, who is talking to us about innovation disguised, GA rules and institutional development in the Republic of Genoa, discussing Jari Eloranta. So, Antonio, can you share your screen?
Yes, I'll try to share it right now. Can you see it?
1, 2. Yes, we see the whole thing.
Okay.
Put in your notes. There you go. Perfect.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I cannot be there in person. So I start with my paper. The aim of this paper is to investigate the institutional development of general average, called also GA, procedures in the Republic of Genoa between the 16th and the 17th centuries. Past studies often stated that early modern Mediterranean states followed uniform rules in the maritime sphere. Bridging the gap between theory and practice, therefore, is central to my methodological approach. I will show you a preliminary legal framework given by local statutes and jurist texts, followed by an analysis of primary evidences that in turn allow a better understanding of the procedure. International rules, such as those governing GA, stimulated scholars' discussions regarding the existence of a hypothetical lex mercatoria. The most enthusiastic supporters of the lex mercatoria contend that This was a sort of universal and autonomous national legal system developed spontaneously by merchants without regard to and independently of states. GA's basic principles survived with few changes from classical Greece to the contemporary period, encouraging scholars to look at the set of average rules enacted in the early modern period as a simple linear development. The contemporary concept of GA derives directly from the Justinian Digest, and in particular from the De Lege Rodia de Iactu. This rule is based on the idea that damage to someone's property occurred during a maritime voyage and caused voluntarily to ensure the safety of the vessel and its cargo should be borne by all participants in the expedition. The concept of GA, which in the digest was closely linked to the act of jettison, which means throwing cargo overboard, irregularly expanded to include administrative expenses and many other damages due to accidents or force majeure. GA, therefore, is a risk-sharing technique that answers to the principle of equity finance. All investors bear a pro rata share of the risks to which the common business, the maritime expedition, is exposed. Maritime law seems to follow the criteria of equity finance to counterbalance the danger and the uncertainty of sea travel. The idea of a linear evolution of GA culminates in the neoclassical return to shared rules accepted by different countries following the York Antwerp rules established in 1890. Other set of rules in the past, in the early modern period, and in the Middle Ages as well, such as the French Rôle d'Oléron and the Catalan Consolat de Mar, are seen as more or less successful attempts of regulatory unification. The Consolat, in particular, published in Barcelona at the end of the 15th century, imposed itself as a point of reference for the European legal world and in subsequent normative elaborations. This did not imply, however, a critical acceptance of its rules by each legislating states. The Consolat de Mar became, in fact, the point of reference for the jus commune of most of the Mediterranean Sea. The chapters related to GA were very detailed and took up Roman law and Mediterranean customs. The Catalan first edition dates back between 1482 and 1484. However, some of the printed versions reported a list that displayed the presumed date of implementation of the book's rules in the various Mediterranean ports, the so-called Crónica de las Promulgaciones that you can see here on the left. This list backdated the writing of the book to the 11th century. According to the Crónica, Genoa adopted the Consolat in 1186. The most renowned 17th and 18th century Genoese jurists, such as Carlo Targa and Giuseppe Casaregi, reported this list in good faith. This is therefore one of the first pitfalls we face when approaching to this topic and to maritime law in general. The Italian editions of the Consolat, consulted the most by Genoese magistrates and jurists until the 18th century, were those of 1564 and 1584. Let us focus now on the specificity of the Genoese context. From 1528, Genoa formally sided with the Spanish Empire, with which it maintained close diplomatic and financial relations, at least until the first half of the 17th century. However, the presence of an anti-Spanish faction within the ruling class of the Republic and the conflicts of jurisdiction between Genoese and Spanish ships probably prompted the desire to formalize an autonomous jurisdiction. From 1551, a few years before the publication of the most known Italian editions of the Consolat, the long preparatory phase of the Genoese civil statutes began. They were promulgated only in 1589 and remained in force without significant changes until the 18th century. The civil statutes did not mention the Consolat, that probably circulated among Genoese merchants in its Catalan version, and introduced some important innovations and clarifications at the institutional and procedural level that deviated from it. The Genoese legislators probably sought to insert the practice of GA into a rigid and apparently autonomous institutional frameworks in order to reduce transaction costs and the related timeframes. The new statutes devoted, as you can see here in the vernacular edition, devoted 2 chapters to GA, one on the calcolatori, which were more just like modern average adjusters, and one on the jettison procedure. This version is from 1613. GA procedures involved a new magistrate created ad hoc, as I mentioned, the calcolatori. They drafted the GA calculation by reporting all the damages, all the contributing assets, which means the ship, the freight, and the cargo, and by calculating the proportion among them. Their role was the main element of divergence from contemporary or previous European legislation, which kept on relying on experts appointed for each case. The chapter on jettison, for example, contained many operational details. It specified how some types of goods like gold, silver, jewels, but also horses and slaves contributed to the repartition of the damages, although they cannot be in turn jettisoned. However, I found a voyage with a jettison horse that cast some shadow on how much this rule was effectively applied. Jurists in the following centuries criticized the Genoese statutes and, in particular, the complexity of the jettison procedure, in which the shipmaster delegated his authority over 3 consuls appointed by the crew and the merchants. According to Andrea Dobati, the burdening of the procedure in Genoa was a mere formal act with no practical application. However, Wilma Borghesi reports, and I cited her here in the middle of the page, although she didn't recognize it, a practical example of the application of a jettison procedure already in 1504. This suggests the presence of either unknown customs or statutes drafted in the same years, if not earlier, as the Catalan first edition of the Consulat. On some criteria, such as the contribution of the value of the ship, the statutes explicitly diverged from the Consulat. They reported that the ship accounted for its entire value, while in the Consulat it accounted only for the half of it. This rule favored shipmasters whose life were at risk during a maritime voyage. Yet the Genoese legislators, usually involved in finance, shipowning, and trade activities, chose to treat in the same way ship owners and merchants. In Targa's opinion, the Genoese statutes could and should not diverge from the Consulat. He considered it essential to share common standards and have procedural convergence between countries in order to avoid differences that could hinder international trade. He wrote that, you can see here, in maritime trade, it is not possible to operate in one way in one part of the world and in a different way in another one, because of the common interest that so many different people may have in the same business. This sentence was written in 1692 to justify the text of the 1589 statutes and to harmonize them with respect to other foreign rules. Targa also elaborated a specific argument to justify this claim. He explained that, although the statutes did not explicitly mention the Consulat, they did accept it because they only referred to the vessel and not to the vessel and accessories. According to Targa, in fact, the value of a vessel consisted of both its hull and its equipment. GA calculation drawn up in the 17th century, however, consistently contradicted Targa's theory, as you can read here. So the calculatori, in the first example, assessed the ship for its total value and not for half of it. Moreover, GA calculations drawn up between 1639 and 1641 very often show, as is the case here, the separate values of the hull and of the different accessories of the ship, and all these values contributed to the damage apportionment. Targa's intention was probably to give strength to a new customary practice applied in Genoa in the second half of the 17th century. The same observations were made by Casareggi, explicitly quoting Targa, and Casareggi wrote a well-known explanation of the Consulat in Italian in 1719. Even nowadays, scholars quote Targa and Casareggi on this topic. The desire to show a procedural continuity derived also from the need to disguise another institutional innovation or institutional divergence, starting from an unspecified moment in the second half of the 17th century, in fact, and without any trace in the legislative sources. The entire management of GA procedures shifted from the calcolatori to another magistrate, the Conservatori del Mare. Perhaps the decision to follow the rules applied in neighboring ports such as Barcelona and Livorno responded to the need to attract foreign vessels to Genoa, which became a general free port in 1609. We know that the commercial rivalry with Livorno, for example, also involved the drafting of GA reports, as shown in the letters written by the English consul resident in Livorno, John Finch, in 1671. The complete entrustment of GA practices to the Conservatori perhaps favored a streamlining of the procedures and a greater standardization, allowing merchants to save time and money. Merchants and insurers, because GA could be insured in Genoa. As stated by North, social actors played a major part of institutional change in its history as they sought to interpret the world around them through ideologies, norms, and value. This applied in Genoa as well, where the leading merchants and businessmen ruling the state were closely linked by business and family relationships. GA rules highlight an effort of bureaucratic administrative uniformity in line with other Italian and European states. The Mediterranean Sea was a boundary where the meeting or competition between different actors favored exchanges of strategies for managing uncertainty and facilitate the dismantling and reassembling of different instruments and institutions. In England, for example, Nicholas Magens stated in the 18th century how, and I quote, "There are in London no commissioners appointed for the settling of affairs relating to insurances and averages. Neither there are any certain laws relating to assurances and averages. Therefore, it is frequently submitted to private opinions, and things will be now and there misunderstood." End of the quotation. So the analysis of the legislation produced and adopted in Genoa challenged the concept of the lex mercatoria, and it gives an example of how an early border state dealt with the institutional development in international maritime law. Genoese oligarchy legislated on the basis of its own agenda, while jurists and following historians tried to harmonize this institutional development by disguising them and by inserting them into a bigger framework. Thank you for your attention. I hope I was inside the 15 minutes.
Thank you, Antonio. Yes, you were well inside 15. Your discussant is Eloranta, who is coming up behind me here. Let me share. Let's see if we can get this all set. This one. Yeah, that'll work. All right. Thank you for a very interesting paper. I'm going to provide some comments that come kind of in the form of you have lots of interesting ideas in your paper, and here's what you could do with them. The paper you circulated before the session, it wasn't really a paper. It's a kind of an extended abstract with lots of interesting ideas. So it wasn't yet fully developed, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. Here are some of the things you could do with it in terms of developing into an article, because I think you have a very interesting project. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time trying to summarize your paper, but basically, in the paper and in your talk, you talk about the notion of lex mercatoria, which is kind of the idea of that there were some type of uniform rules for shipping and trade in the 16th and 17th century, and you use Genoa as your case study. And you talk about how perhaps certain institutional continuities existed with the past, including as far back as the Roman Empire. And perhaps that institutional innovations were the key to this, that they were sometimes sort of masked or disguised in the form of existing institutional arrangements. You also
talk a lot about in your paper about the general average rules, and you talk about them in the context of the maritime trade in the Mediterranean. And you link them with the kind of the early modern legal system and the idea of risk and competition. And in particular, you talk a little bit about in your paper about transaction costs, something that I will get back to. Now, there are interesting themes that you explore in this preliminary paper draft, but yet it's not quite constructed in a way that, and you know this, that it would need to be constructed to make it into a journal article, for example. It would be much improved, I would say, if you have in the beginning, you'd have you kind of get right into the meat of the matter in the paper. If you had a proper introduction with the main questions, discussion of the sources, particularly you throw around interesting legal sources and documents, but it's hard to get a good sort of overall picture of the coverage that you provide in this paper. And also the theoretical discussion is kind of sprinkled in throughout the paper, which makes it a little bit harder to gauge. Now, my first suggestion would be that you could link this to some broader debates that are going on in for example, early modern trade. In the last 15 years or so, I'm part of that discussion in a minor way, but there's been a lot of new literature, new data on early modern trade, mostly, yes, on the Atlantic and the Baltic Sea. And the Baltic Sea, particularly, is mining this very rich data set contrived from the Sound Toll Register. And the book there in the corner, by the way, is a reflection of that. But they're providing a lot of new comparative data, also about networks, which we've heard in this session today, roles of merchants, information flows, etc. There's scholars like Werner Scheldjens, Jari Ojala, and others who've written quite a bit about this. And I think that would provide a good sort of context for your paper to talk about the Mediterranean trade. There's also this kind of literature and discussion of Mediterranean trade as well as the Black Sea that you could include in your paper. Set it up better. In terms of the theoretical side, you kind of, as I said, you sprinkle in the new institutional economics literature there. Although you mainly you're using Douglas North's works, which kind of begs the question why. There are a lot of interesting stuff you could have linked to this. I'm just mentioning, given the Genoese connection, if you're talking about continuities in institutions, you certainly should reflect on Abner Greif's work on medieval Genoa about the kind of the guilds and the political economy behind this, because it would provide a nice sort of context for this. Or you could also talk about Venice and Comenda and work by Yadira Gonzalez de Lara. All these things would, I think, strengthen the sort of theoretical focus you have, especially about the idea of continuity or discontinuity of legal traditions. And I was particularly wanting a little bit more on the transaction cost side, because it has been applied to early modern trade. I mentioned just Jari Ojala and Leos Müller, but there's others who have approached this. There's some of these more quantitative, some of this more qualitative work. Nonetheless, I think it would be a useful addition to this. Now, also, I think the new institutional economics literature could strengthen the idea of you exploring how much these rules were put into practice. Because you talk about some of these jurists and legal traditions, and you have a big project, I know, the actual legal cases, looking at how these were interpreted, because we know that there were probably a lot of differences in different places, and those court cases might provide more context on this. Also, I was particularly interested in more theoretical sense, the kind of the gaps between the formal and informal rules in these cases, and over time, is if there's a change in that. I would wager there probably were quite a big gaps in terms of those two things. Now, it would be also interesting to hear more about, because this is an era of intense competition between several city-states, particularly Genoa and Venice, Venetian case, which is, there's so much literature on, you could definitely bring that in. Now, my bigger question, I think, is overall, you should be perhaps more assertive and clearer as to what does this mean. If your paper eventual or article would show that institutional innovations were disguised under institutional continuity, kind of a form of partial path dependence, okay, that would be an interesting contribution. The gaps between formal and informal institutions, that would be an interesting contribution. But ultimately, I would want to know more about the outcomes. What did this mean for trade in the Mediterranean area? For example, if there truly were these accepted uniform rules and they were starting to interpret them perhaps in similar ways, did that lead to trade, convergence, economic growth, etc.? That would always, of course, be one of the questions that economic historians would be very interested in. Also, the idea about the political economy, the political fiscal role, increasing role of merchants, and that has a wide range of implications. So it's a very interesting paper, but it needs to be developed into these different directions. It requires some reorganization to become an article. However, I think there's an interesting contribution here, exploring the formal rules, informal practices, continuities in institutions, perhaps how they're evolved or they're disguised or sold or applied, and what that meant for trading practices overall. I would also urge that there's a lot of this type of research being done, as I said, early modern period, networks working on Atlantic, Baltic, Mediterranean, the Black Sea. There's people who are working next summer, for example, at the World Congress. There'll be interesting sessions. I think once you tie your cases into those networks and so forth, I think you will have lots of interesting things to say, even at the scale of Mediterranean trade on the aggregate. And I think that collaboration will be useful for you, and I think will be very useful for the maritime historians who are working on these issues. So thank you for a very interesting paper.
Are there any questions from the audience? And again, apologies for having their mic that doesn't seem to want to work. Okay. David, come to mic, please. We'll see if you can hear, Antonio.
So, to follow up on some of the themes that
Pause.
Jari was raising.
Can you hear this?
Is it working?
Not quite well.
Is it working now?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, to follow up on some of the themes Jari was mentioning, one of the things I wanted to hear more about, and you touched on, was this idea of the law merchant, the lex mercatorium, the sort of larger theme with this. I don't know it real well, but I understand there's sort of some controversy whether this really exists. One interpretation by some is that the existence of law merchant shows that legal rules can develop spontaneously, don't require some centralized leviathan, that merchants can work them out. And one of the issues is, does the case you're looking at here sort of confirm that or support that versus sort of counter ideas? So I would like to, I would suggest sort of embodying this in this larger law merchant set of issues. That's my
Okay, I couldn't hear the last part of the question.
Yeah, you got away from the mic towards the end.
Okay.
There, David.
So what I would suggest is maybe positioning things you look at in terms of what could be viewed as sort of a larger set of controversies about the existence of law merchant. Whether it shows that there actually were these legal rules emerging spontaneously without sort of centralized government involvement, versus those who argue that that's a misinterpretation of what was happening.
Mm-hmm. Sheilagh, do you want to unmute and ask your question too?
I just wanted to add to the question, the comment that was just made, which is that there is a huge debate about whether there was such a thing as the law merchant. And I would suggest looking at the publications from the 70s and 80s of Professor John Baker, who's an eminent legal historian, and then a subsequent paper by Emily Cadens, which also argues that the law merchant was basically a myth. And both of them are legal historians, and they trace the things that were supposedly unique to the law merchant back to existing state-provided law codes. And I think it would be really interesting to see you position your findings within the context of that debate about the lex mercatoria, given that there are these skeptical views that it didn't exist at all.
Thank you, Sheilagh. So, Antonio, do you want to respond to Jari and these other comments? And we'll wrap up.
Yeah, okay. Thank you all for your comments. I noted them down, and there is quite a lot of stuff to think about and to work on. You all gave me interesting suggestions. Regarding the wider debate on the lex mercatoria will be certainly one of the main directions in which my research will go. And plus, I am working on a database, as maybe Jari will know, on general average calculations drawn up in Genoa. I have like more than 900 calculations from the 17th century. And so once the database will be online, and it should go online by the World Economic Congress, Economic History Congress in Paris this year, I should be able to do some more research and to use the transaction costs analysis in order to put this work in the wider context of the new institutional economics, etc. So, thank you for all these suggestions. And if please, Jari, do you have a PowerPoint? If you can send me the PowerPoint, it would be helpful. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you everyone here and online for joining us for this session. It's